Welcome everybody to another episode of the Future Founder Promise podcast. I'm here with Tacho today, who has a whole bunch of experience in the engineering management space and has been coaching a lot of leaders on how to build engineering teams. I'm really excited to chat with her today because I've known of her and she's an old friend of mine for a long time. So I'm excited to really dive deep and kick us off with a first question that I'm actually really curious about and that I know she's been thinking about a lot recently, which is, Laura, how do you measure developer productivity, particularly if you run an entire engineering organization?
I'm so glad you asked me that, Max. Thanks for the lovely intro. I mean, let's just get started with one of the most controversial questions in engineering, right now. So productivity, it turns out, means a dozen different things to every single person. And even your own definition of it might change depending on the context. So when we think about productivity, the first thing that's really important is to get a common definition of it with your team. And I find that a lot of teams actually skip this. They think about things like, pull requests or commits or story point velocity, when actually what might matter more is user adoption or cycle time or something else. So if you don't have the common definition, it's really hard to figure out what to change or what to optimize. So that's just the start. That's scratching the surface of it. I'm curious, Max, about how you think about developer productivity.
Well, I was talking to Abhinoda, who's the founder of DX, where he was previously the founder of Panda, which eventually got acquired by GitHub, and they built a bunch of Git analytics. And I had a conversation with him back then where he was telling me, they'd been building this Git analytics tool for a long time, but realized that most of the metrics that they can actually automatically generate aren't super valuable. Like they're not providing the level of insights that the engineering leaders would like. And so I know he went off and built DX and is now focused much more on sort of a qualitative survey approach from what I understand. Have you seen DX? What do you think about that?
I have, and I am very hesitant to ever recommend a tool, but DX is one of the tools that I actually break my own rule for. Because I'm a coach, and part of my credibility is my neutrality. I kind of take the, if you're into food, you might know J. Kenji Lopez-Alt. He's a kind of famous celebrity chef, but sometimes you'll see restaurants on his Instagram page, or like he's saying, oh, I really like this cheese from like this cheesemaker, but he's always so clear that he never takes free stuff. He will always pay for it, and you cannot buy his opinion for anything. So that's very much the attitude that I have, because that is my credibility as a trusted third party to help you get better. But DX is something I do really believe. I mean, they don't pay me to do this. They don't send me free cheese either or anything. I just was recently at Lead Dev London speaking about productivity and effectiveness, and I'll kind of summarize my main point, which is that up until now, we have been indoctrinated with the idea that automatic measurements from tools like GitHub and Jira, telemetry data, is magnitudes more valuable than subjective data that comes from self-reporting. And we've been living in this or world where we either look at automatically generated data or automatically collected data, or we look at survey metrics, but never together. And what DX does is actually help you understand that the self-reflective part of it is a lot more important than we think it is, living in the or world that we live in now. Because the thing is that the automatic data, telemetry data from GitHub, might take a poorly performing team and help them get better. But it will never, ever take a good team and make them great. There is just diminishing returns the higher performing that you are. And I guarantee that if you just ask your developers what slows you down, what feels like friction, what makes you less effective, they will tell you. They know about it because they experience it every day. So instead of wasting all this time and quite honestly all this money, because I implemented Git Prime 4.5 years ago, back before it got acquired by Pluralsight. That was a very expensive tool that honestly did quite nothing. It didn't help us get better. The data was very novel for the beginning part of it. It was interesting to the management group, but for whatever reason, and I know there's a lot of reasons that aren't necessarily Git Prime's problem or a problem with the product, it just never landed well with the group, and it didn't ever get us to the result that, that's promised in their marketing. But what has always helped is data from retrospectives, discussions, one-on-one conversations, hackathons at team retreats where we work on a problem that's really facing the team, that they come together and say, hey, this is a problem for us, we want to fix it. That's all the self-reported data that we've kind of been trained to not look at and not view as important as the telemetry data coming from GitHub. Just doesn't look as cool on a dashboard,
It's fascinating to hear that telemetry data is actually useful for poorly performing teams. I wasn't aware of that. So could you maybe talk about that? So you're essentially saying like the Git Prime, Git Analytics kind of metrics, they're useful for taking a poor performing team and helping it improve a little bit. But then once you're in a good state, getting to great requires a very different approach from the sort of automatic telemetry.
Yeah, definitely. I had this conversation with Gergely Oros from Pragmatic Engineer recently, and I think he had something on Twitter about agile and process. And that kind of follows the same pattern where like very prescriptive things like agile processes or looking at certain metrics will help low performing teams get better, because the opportunity space for improvement is just very vast. And there has to be some reason that those teams aren't yet performing with all of the information and education available to them. And so maybe it is using a tool or using a particular process that's the impetus or the catalyst to help them get better. And so it can help expose those problems and see those bottlenecks that are not very difficult to optimize. But when you have a team that's performing really well, so the example that he shared was, when DORA metrics came out, and we can talk about what DORA metrics are, but these are a collection of metrics that measure the efficiency and effectiveness of your software delivery systems. For a lot of teams in the elite category, which is like the highest that you can go, the highest performing, DORA metrics didn't help them at all. It didn't help them get better because they're already elite. So where do you go? But in order to qualify as elite, all you had to do really was use continuous delivery from the beginning, and maybe be a company that started within the 5 years prior to DORA metrics coming out. So when I was at CodeShip, we were in like the elite. We were a CI/CD company that had practiced automated testing, continuous delivery from day one. By no means were we perfect, but DORA metrics really couldn't help a team like us. And I think there were lots of teams that, thought, oh, great, we're elite, but we know we can get better. So what do we do? And that's just something that telemetry data really isn't going to help you find out.
That's fascinating to hear. It sounds almost like since everything's sort of becoming software now, or very many things are becoming software, right? The bar has almost risen much, much higher than the DORA metrics can help you. The DORA metrics probably work great if you are, a large existing organization that's trying to digitally transform to have a part of your company that does software, and to get those kinds of organizations set up. I'm sure they work to a certain extent. But if you're already in the software industry, you're already sort of like the elite of, the bar that people set for every single company, but you're really a software company, and so your level of elite appears to be probably much, much, much higher than what those traditional organizations would mean. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're essentially saying to get from, a good software company to being a really great software company, like you were trying to do at CodeShip or did at CodeShip, those metrics really weren't helpful at all. You needed different ways of measuring the developer productivity. Yeah,
exactly. And I think what's interesting as well, I think we have similar backgrounds in the sense that we've spent a lot of our careers in the developer tool area and in software for other people who make software. And I realize that is absolutely a bubble. And there, it is worth calling that out, because that is, bias that I have and that you have. It's like, this is the world that we live in. But I think a lot of people that are at a startup have that same experience, whether they're in fintech or edtech or health tech. It's kind of a factor of the size and age of the company, not necessarily the sector. But yeah, DORA metrics, DORA metrics came out of so much research, and at the time they were groundbreaking. This was the first time that we were able to look at all of this data from 30,000 survey respondents and boil that down to 4 metrics that are common with all of the subset of those 30,000 respondents that consistently hit their business goals. So that's it's just like a very remarkable research feat. So that was, it really kind of it opened the conversation, and it set the industry on a path to be more curious about this and to be a bit more mature in thinking about like, what are we actually trying to measure? What's the outcome that we're looking for? The downside of DORA metrics, though, is that they are often just seen as a checklist right now, because you look at, okay, there's these 4 metrics, and if I measure these things, then I will achieve elite status, or the way to achieve elite status is simply by measuring these things. And I mean, the whole premise of DORA metrics is that they fit into a software delivery system that also includes team culture and also includes developer effectiveness and friction and all these other things. But those parts aren't as attractive and like marketable maybe as a checklist. Like you'll see Google Cloud. If you search DORA metrics, Google Cloud is going to be one of the top hits because Google acquired DORA. And they're going to say, are you an elite performer? You can use Google Cloud to hit these 4 key objectives and become elite. So, I mean, part of it is like the industry kind of sucking up that DORA metric goodness and kind of turning it into something that's marketable, that people want to buy.
I hear essentially DORA metrics are fine and they're a part of assessing developer productivity, but they can't tell the whole story. So what does that whole story look like for you across the clients you've coached, across the companies you've worked at? What has worked really well to assess essentially the engineering organization as a whole topic?
This is a complex question, because we can talk about the efficiency and throughput of systems, and for that particular question, I think that DORA metrics are very appropriate. They are a good way to understand the throughput of systems. I think where people get a little bit led astray is thinking about DORA metrics as a proxy for productivity, because a system can have high throughput, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're producing the right things. So there's a bit of subtlety and a bit more thinking that needs to go into that. I think the other interesting thing about DORA is what I mentioned before, that often the team aspect, the cultural aspect is kind of left out, or it's just not the thing that's easily rememberable because the checklist is much more attractive. Nicole Forsgren, who is the lead researcher on DORA metrics, I think she's a name that a lot of people know. She went on with another research team to create the SPACE framework of developer productivity. And the SPACE framework is sort of like DORA evolved. So where DORA just looks really at the software delivery performance metrics, SPACE is all about the experience of a developer. And thinking back to DX, when we're talking about qualitative versus quantitative data, a tool that's taking surveys from developers is really focusing on their experience, not necessarily focusing on throughput metrics for a particular system. So they're kind of measuring different things, but SPACE is very aligned to that measurement of productivity as a multidimensional thing, also including developer experience as part of productivity. And I think the SPACE framework I think we're on the cusp of it being more widely adopted and more talked about. It's just not as snappy as the DORA metrics. There's no checklist. It kind of comes out and says, like, listen, this is complex and you're going to have to do some thinking and you have to think about what your company goals are. And quite honestly, some people just don't want to do that work. They want something that's easy, that they can say, like, give me a dashboard and I'll look at it and then I can see if we're going up or going down.
It's interesting to me that there's engineering leaders that wouldn't want to do that work. I think that's maybe a little bit surprising, not coming from that world, having worked as an IC engineer. I feel like, what is a leader doing if they're not aligning their organization's goals with the company-wide goals? Do you know what I mean? Like that feels like a very core part of what your job is.
Yeah, and I think that by and large, most engineering leaders do want to do the work. I think that one of the big reasons that leaders are pressured to measure developer productivity or produce some metric it's because of pressure from their executive teams and their boards who are non-technical people. So whenever I see someone acting in a way that surprises me, of like, as you said, aren't you supposed to be driving alignment in your organization? Isn't that your job? The question I ask myself is, where's the pressure coming from? Where's the stress coming from? Where's the pressure coming from? And you can always trace it back. Because when you understand someone's motivation to do something and what's at stake for them, first of all, you can understand why they're acting the way that they are, but then also you can figure out a way to help them. And that's a great skill to have as an IC or someone who's earlier in their career, even in a manager career, is figuring out how to enable the leaders above you to do their jobs better, because that will just make you stand out so much more. So I think the desire to have something that's kind of quick and straightforward and easy to implement comes out of the stress and pressure that engineering leaders are faced with from their board or from their CEO to deliver some metric similar to how sales can give you revenue numbers, or sales can give you, average deal size, or they can give you new logos. There's really not an equivalent in engineering. It's really difficult. So we have like lines of code. We all know that's not good. Story point velocity, PRs closed, deployments. It's just, there's really no analog. And that's what makes it so challenging. And you have to unpack what productivity means, what that metric really is serving, so that it's not something that leads your team astray or kind of makes you seem out of touch.
I think, like you mentioned earlier to me, as the CEO of a business now, the whole reason for us existing is that we provide value to our customers, right? Like that's the reason why we're a business. We do things for other people and we help them achieve whatever goals our product helps them achieve. And to me, it's almost like you can measure the developer, like the sort of systems process efficiency of a thing moving through your entire development workflow. But really what matters is, did the user get what they want at the end, right? Like, have we provided more value to our customers? That to me is really the ultimate goal of why we even existed as a business as a whole. And so I think what you were mentioning earlier, sort of tracking a little bit more against that rather than just the pure efficiency of the processes, sounds really reasonable to me.
Yeah. I think for every development team, they have a loop that they need to close. So for a company at Stellate size, or even at CodeShip size, we were really invested in user outcomes. As an engineering team, we were sitting with product managers, we were sitting with marketing at the same table, coming up with ideas to have this particular user outcome. There's definitely teams on the other end of the spectrum that are very disconnected. So what I encourage people to do is like figure out, where does your loop close? Does your loop close with a customer outcome? Does your loop close with something that another team is then enabled to do? What are you responsible for? What's that cycle? And then how do you measure success for that? Maybe that is, maybe your whole job is to provide common build tooling for teams, in which case the, cycle time from commit to production is like is your North Star metric. That is the thing that you should be focused on. Whereas like, for a team like at CodeShip or at other smaller companies, startups that are growing right now and scaling, it might be something with user adoption. It might be experimentation. It might be something different that your company values. The point is, and one of the things that the SPACE framework really hits hard, is that it's imperative that leaders think about the goals of the business first before coming up with metrics. And I'll share one example of it just to illustrate this, because it came up last week when I was at Lead Dev, and I just thought it was such a good, perfect illustration. They are using, I can't remember which tool, whether it was Pluralsight Flow or Code Climate Velocity, it doesn't matter. Often these tools track code churn. But this person was responsible for a team who's doing a rewrite of a core service. Their entire point of existing is churn, and they're getting dinged that there's too much churn and therefore they're not productive. And that is just a perfect example of why off-the-shelf metrics that aren't looked at through the right lens of a business goal or just taken out of context can actually end up doing a lot of harm rather than good, because it just completely doesn't match up with what the team is trying to do.
That's a fantastic example for where somebody really didn't take the context of the metric into account based on what the team is really working on.
Yeah, exactly.
I also I'm really curious, when you think about sort of the larger scale of companies, how much investment do you see companies making into developer productivity? How many teams do they have dedicated to, build tooling, for example? Is that something that's very common at larger companies? Or does that tend to be a little bit of a fight? It feels to me from the outside, having not been in that position, it feels to me from the outside like even a small improvement in build times, for example, magnified to the scale of thousands of engineers, probably has a large impact on the overall output of the company. Absolutely.
These are expensive problems to solve. Most of the time, your engineers are the most highly paid people at the company. So, and it's not just the money, it's like the time cost. I mean, think about what your team could be doing if they weren't spending an extra hour a day waiting for stuff to compile or stuff to build or deploy, babysitting deployments. I see really all across the board approaches to this. So I'm working with one client now, huge global company. They actually have I forget the exact title, like an engineering practice engineer who leads initiatives on like better tooling, improvements to developer experience, those kinds of things. I've also worked with companies who have a whole developer experience team. I've also worked with companies, though, big and small, where developer experience is the responsibility of the team and they're fully autonomous for their own build systems. So, everyone's using Circle CI. They're all in charge of their own repos on GitHub. It's up to them to fix their build times or fix those flaky tests or do other things. It's like a you build it, you run it kind of scenario. And in those companies, which I find that's my preferred method, quite honestly, that these teams are responsible for building it. They're responsible for shipping it. They run it. A lot of times these teams are also on call. They don't have dedicated SRE functions because they're small enough where it makes sense. But can be a really effective model in developer experience because everyone has a stake in it. You're not having to raise a ticket to some external team to say like, hey, can we update dependencies here or like add this to our CLI or whatever. They just have the autonomy to go and do it because they know what they need.
Do you find that the kinds of companies that have sort of DXP responsibility of the team itself, that they also work maybe more in a microservices model? It sounds to me like if a team owns their entire thing, builds and runs their entire thing anyway, it doesn't make sense for somebody else to then go to somebody else and be like, please fix our build system, because they won't have any context at all, right? I imagine a world in which you have, hundreds of engineering teams, each running their own services. Of course they have to own the developer experience, right? Because otherwise, no external team can come in and be like, we're going to fix your build system, because they have no context at all.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common archetype of teams that have that model, is that they're operating in microservice architecture, or maybe even like a modular monolith where there is just like a very clear boundary and separation of concerns, even if they're using like a monolithic architectural approach. But yeah, exactly right. These teams can choose their own languages, they can choose their own tools, they can choose their own, whatever they want, because everything is nicely self-contained and decoupled from the rest of the architecture.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to switch tracks to coaching for a little bit, but before I do that, if there's any engineering leaders or even ICs listening, what is the number one tip that you would give these people to improve their developer productivity in whatever shape or form? What is the most common problem you see, and what is the most common solution that works in your experience? And then also maybe, what would you recommend for someone who wants to go deeper? Where should they go to learn more about all this new thinking around developer productivity?
Yeah, I have two answers to your first question of like, what's the low-hanging fruit here? The first one is ask your team about what their definition of productivity is. It is amazing. I just had a thread on this on Twitter the other day about there was a study done at Microsoft about how developers define productivity, how managers define productivity, and then how each group thinks the other defines productivity. And it's wild. It was really wild. So I won't spoil it. It's interesting. Go read the thread. But let's just say developers and managers have different opinions of productivity, which makes it really hard to identify things to work on. So find that common definition, make space for it, don't assume. And then the second thing is just poll the developers. It can be a Google form. It can be a tool like DX that specializes in it and writes questions for you. But I am surprised at how much clear direction teams are able to get just by a simple survey, 5 questions or less, asking about how satisfied are you? Where's your biggest bottleneck? Where do you feel friction on a daily basis? That's going to give you a lot more insight than spending a month and a half trying to get telemetry data going. For those of you that are wanting to learn more, I have a course on productivity and effectiveness. So if it feels overwhelming to read all of these studies and look at all these data points and metrics and not quite understand like which ones are relevant to you, you can take my course. Just go to lauratacho.com, click on courses, you'll find it. If you're looking for something to read, Google the SPACE framework of developer productivity. It's in the ACMQ. You'll get a nice PDF of it. It's a quick read. It's like maybe, I don't even know, 15. It's like dozens of pages, not hundreds. You can read it easily in like probably 15 minutes or 20 minutes, but that's worth the investment of just like understanding that. There's also a really, really great paper if you are already on a journey with DORA metrics and have noticed like, these aren't working the way that I expected. There's a paper called How to Abuse and Misuse DORA Metrics. I believe that's what it's called. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think if you Google that, you will find it. It is a really excellent case study about rolling out DORA metrics and what went well, what didn't go well, and lessons learned. So basically what not to do with DORA metrics if you're looking for a particular result.
Awesome. So check out Laura's course, Google for the SPACE framework paper, which is apparently on ACMQ, and Google for the paper, How to Use and Misuse DORA Metrics are the 3 recommendations here to go deeper.
Definitely.
Is there anything, do you have any recommendations for ICs? If I'm an engineer at a company, I'm listening to this and I'm like, I feel like I can't be as productive as I want, and the organization isn't investing in my productivity into the engineering organization, what would you recommend for ICs can they move the needle somehow?
I definitely think they can move the needle. I think it's difficult, especially if you're like a senior IC or a staff IC. You have to really learn how to wield that indirect influence, and that's always a really big challenge. But coming to that conversation prepared with data, having well-formed opinions, and also being prepared to maybe do some education yourself, because there's just a lot of information out there. We have all of it at our fingertips, and sometimes people miss things, or it's just hard to know with things changing so quickly what's best practice now. So if you can be that person that helps educate others around you, that's great. My biggest tip here of like how to wield that indirect influence is that FOMO is the most impactful tool for influence. When you do something that's great and people look at it and they're like, ooh, I'm missing out. I want that. That is the best way. And if you can form a hypothesis, maybe by talking to your peers, and you say, you know what, we really need to focus on PR review turnaround times. Let's do that for the next sprint. And let's see, actually, we all have the feeling that it's taking forever to get our PRs reviewed. Maybe it's because there's too many single engineer projects and it's like too burdensome for someone else to take the time away from their project and review your PR. Or maybe it's because you have way too many Dependabot notifications and everyone ignores your pull requests. There's a number of reasons, but make a concerted effort. Let's work on PR review times and then just see what happens. See how you feel about productivity, see how much more you ship, see how much better your the forecast, your estimated work versus actual delivered work comes. And I guarantee that when you have the results, people will be like, oh, they have FOMO. They're like, oh crap, what is that team doing that we're not doing? I want some of that. And that's such a great way to drive change at a company. I
think something I've realized recently is that small ways that I can act myself have a large impact on everybody else. Of course, now as a leader in the CEO position, that is extra magnified. But even in an IC position, if you set an example for how to show up and how quickly the PRs get reviewed, then other people will look at that and go, oh wow, my PR gets reviewed really quickly. And then there's almost like a sort of, what is the word for that? An expectation that they set on themselves where they're like, my PR always gets reviewed really quickly. I want to review your PRs really quickly as well because I feel bad otherwise, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I've come to realize that a lot of our head of ops and people, Sue Audio actually has a saying, she always says, people, process, then platform, right? You gotta start with the culture. You gotta at least have one person act in the way that they would like to act, right? Act in the way that they would like the team to act. And then eventually that hopefully culturally transcends at least your team and eventually the organization. Now, of course, at the large scale, that takes a long while longer than at a 10-person company, but it does actually happen that way where people look at you and they go, oh, I wanna act that way, right? And then as you get further along that spectrum, you can start introducing dedicated processes to make that happen and eventually maybe even build a platform. But really, you have to start with the people. You have to start with acting the way that you would like the team to act. And eventually, I think you get to a point where people feel an expectation of acting that way, hopefully.
Yeah, and this is a good segue to talk more about coaching because I talk about how small improvements compound over time really often with my clients, because I think as leaders, and then often people who have people-pleasing tendencies, they're used to being at the top of their game all the time, we can get really stuck and overwhelmed with like, okay, well, I want to improve developer productivity, but I don't have the time to do all the research that I want to do, or, run all of the surveys that I want to run, or educate myself, or try all of these tools, so I'm just not going to do anything. And that is a really bad approach because you get stuck in analysis paralysis, and you could have made one small change that then compounds over time because like the time is now. I mean, if you do even one small thing that saves 20 seconds on build time, you have that running for a week. That's a considerable amount. And then you can check that off your list and move on to the next thing. So you don't necessarily have to be the perfect expert. You can simply try something. Most decisions are easy to reverse. So if you try something, it doesn't work, just reverse it, try something else. That's the experimental mindset that we put on a pedestal. We're engineers, we do A/B testing, we have experimental mindset, but when we actually look at the decisions that we make day to day, it's surprising at how anti-experimental a lot of us can tend to be because we feel the pressure to get it perfect on the first try. And that's just not a realistic expectation to have.
I 100% agree. Something you'll hear pretty often said at meetings at Stellate is this safe to try? This seems safe to try. Let's just try it, right? If it works or not, then we can reassess, because most decisions we make every single day are pretty reversible, right?
Yeah,
with a little bit of effort,
really
but most of them are pretty much reversible. Only very few are actually irreversible. And being aware of that actually lets you spend more time on the irreversible ones and make sure that you make an informed decision. But then the reversible ones, just try it, right? Let's just keep moving. Let's try gating in that direction, and then we'll learn anyway if it works or not. If we just try it, we'll know afterwards if it worked or not, and we can actually iterate based on the result of the outcome, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and what you're doing with that is creating an environment where failure is not just tolerated, but it's a part of the process. And, a lot of companies don't do that, where, there's that stupid trope of like in the TV show where someone makes a mistake at work and they get like marched into their boss's office and raked over the coals. And it's like the next scene is them packing up their desk and like leaving because they get fired. I mean, that doesn't really happen. It does happen. It does happen. But that's like, it's such an overblown thing that we are afraid of failure, when experimentation is very healthy, because you should for every like 10 bets you make, 9 of them are going to fail. But the one of them that succeeds is going to make up for all the 9 that failed. But you're never going to get to that 10th unless you do the 9 failures. So that mindset or that culture that you're creating, that failure is not just celebrated, but it's like a requirement almost of this iterative process and iterative journey that we're on, is such a healthy thing for companies.
I 100% agree. You mentioned that this is one of the topics that comes up pretty frequently in your coaching practice. I actually want to take a quick step back and ask maybe a stupid question. What is coaching to you, right? When you talk about coaching and engineering leaders, what does that even mean?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think coaching, mentoring, advising, these kind of get thrown around. They all have different definitions, but I think that probably doesn't matter to most of us. I'll kind of give you my definition. So someone asked me on LinkedIn yesterday, they sent me a message like related something. I met them at Lead Dev and they were like, oh, I'm really interested in the fact that you're a coach. Like, you must get called in to companies that are like totally failing so that you can turn them around. And that's the first time I've been asked that question. And I wonder how many people think that, because that is the polar opposite of what I do. So I am not a doctor. I am a coach. So if you want to run a marathon and improve your time, you are already a great athlete and you are looking for that next level of greatness. That is what coaching is for. It is not for if you just had a heart attack, then I'm going to help you rehabilitate after this like terrible event that happened health-wise. So coaching is really, for me, the clients that I work with are already top performers at the top of their game, either going through a period of transition. They've just taken on a lot of responsibility. Maybe they've started a company themselves. They're doing something for the first time. Or they're trying to get to that next level. So I have some clients right now that were just promoted to director, or they're trying to get that promotion and they need some outside perspective to help break their own bad habits that they can't see. Because the reality is that, this as CEO, you don't have a peer at your company. There's no one that's doing your job that can look at you and be like, Max, I think that was kind of crap. I'm sure you hear that maybe from the rest of the leaders at your company, but it's really difficult to get good feedback about leadership skills the higher up you go, and that's when a coach can be really impactful.
I actually think I 100% subscribe to that, and I actually think a coach can be really valuable at any level, because just like an athlete, right? No athlete has ever become the best in the world without a coach, because you cannot give yourself the same level of feedback that somebody external to you can. And so I think not just for the leadership, but really everybody benefits from getting a coach. And actually at Stellate, a while back, I think now 3-4 months ago, we introduced coaching for everyone. So we use a service and everybody gets a completely external and their own coach that they get to choose based on their preferences. And then they work with that coach on a weekly basis, just on their own professional and personal development. And based on what our employees have told us, it's been transformational for them, right? They get to work with this coach on how can I be a better human at work, right? And that involves things around, for example, for the software engineers, that involves things around engineering, but really it involves things for them personally, right? And so, for example, for me, I've worked with a coach for a while now, and for me, one of the biggest realizations was that I very often act out of a fear of loneliness, right? Basically, my core existence as a person is defined by a very deep fear of loneliness. I love being with people, I love talking to people, and I have a fear of people not liking me. And in certain ways, that's working well for me, right? There's ways in which that helps me be more personable. I can talk to anyone. Right? There's ways in which it sort of shows positively, but there's also many ways in which that shows negatively, right? I'm conflict averse. I don't tend to get into conflict. I don't tend to give people direct feedback that I have in my head. And so through this realization of what is the root cause of me facing both of these problems and disadvantages, I'm now able to work through that, and I can actually take that into account when I make a decision, right? And now I notice myself being conflict averse, and I go, look, Max, you're shying away from this task that really you should be doing, right? That's going to move the company forward, because you're acting in a way that's congruent with your fear of loneliness, and really just get over that hump, right? And 99% of the time, my fear of loneliness was completely overblown. But even when it isn't, it's important for me to get those tasks done, and I need to do them anyway and not shy away from them. And so that's just to give an example. Like for me personally, it's also been incredibly transformational. And I think for everyone at Stellate, it's pretty much the same. What are some of the common problems that you see engineering leaders have at the organizations? We talked earlier about sort of this experimental, safe to try mentality. What else are some of the common threads that keep coming up in your practice?
It's surprising to me how so many different companies and different leaders that have such different backgrounds, we talk about like the same 5 things. in coaching calls. And being conflict averse, protecting our own egos is in the top 3, no doubt. So, coaching can be really transformative in terms of leadership skills. My flavor of coaching is very unique because I was a VP of engineering for years and have been senior director. I have held these senior leadership positions and run engineering organizations in scaling companies. So the leaders that I work with benefit from my coaching skills, but also I have amassed this amount of like data from real life where I can say like, okay, you're going to try that and this is probably going to be the outcome. Is this what you really want? So we can kind of dip more into that practical thing. But I will say conflict aversion, hesitancy to give feedback is very, very common. Lack of clear expectations, extremely, extremely, extremely common. And then we get into some interesting topics like building trust on a team or how to have influence if you're a staff engineer, for example, and you don't have reporting power. How do you build trust and build influence and maneuver through your organization? So those are some pretty common topics that are fairly universal to a lot of the clients that I work with. And also, just to call it out for those of you listening thinking, oh man, I feel like there's so many things that I do wrong. Everyone has stuff that they need to work on. I have a coach, okay? It is just human nature to have blind spots to your own things, and that's what a coach can do. Like, I'm going to call you out and ask you those hard questions or kind of say like, well, you're telling me this one thing, but you're acting this other way. Let's get that out there because something's not matching up here. And I'm not going to put my own ego of like, oh, I'm worried that you're going to not like me if I call you out on your stuff. That's that fear of loneliness. I am going to be the one to give you that hard feedback. And leaders really need it because they don't get it anywhere else.
I think very often people, to me, it's obvious that coaching makes sense even if you already feel like you're good at what you're doing, because even a Rafael Nadal or a Steph Curry or whatever sports metaphor you would like, they all have coaches because you can always be better at what you do. There's no ceiling, right? And I think people sometimes go, oh, I'm really good at what I do, but really you can always be better. That's just a core belief I have. I don't think anyone's ever done. I don't think anyone's ever achieved sort of the nirvana of their professional life. I think you can always be better. And I think what I'm hearing you say essentially is there's people out there who are either scared of being judged for it because they think, that if I have a coach, then I'm basically admitting I'm not the best at what I do. And I don't think that's true at all. I think even the people who are the best, or I actually think, quite on the contrary, I think the people who are the best at what they do wouldn't have gotten there without coaching, and they're not going to keep being the best at what they do if they don't keep having coaching, is probably how I would phrase that.
Yeah. If Beyonce has a vocal coach, you, regular human being, can have a coach for your professional and leadership skills.
I love that example. I love that example.
That is, I think that's really what you said. You summed it up so nicely that you need coaching just to maintain excellence as well. It's not always about getting to the next level. If you don't maintain excellence, you're going to start to atrophy pretty quickly. If you're not, if you are an elite athlete, there is some level of like commitment. You're in that gym like 4 hours a day with your coach working on it, maybe just to maintain baseline. So there's so many different scenarios where coaching is a great option.
So I guess a practical question that might be on people's minds is, how do you find a coach and what should you look for?
Coaching is really personal, and it is really time intensive for you. So I got introduced to coaching by having my own really fantastic executive coach back when I was at CloudBees. And it truly, truly transformed my ability to lead and set my career on a different trajectory. I was surprised though at just like how great, but then also how bad I felt after every session. Bad in a good way though, because there was just so much stuff that I didn't realize was there that I needed to address and that I needed to think through. And I wouldn't have been able to go that layer deeper without someone guiding me to it. It can also be really, really awkward. So one of the things that I do with clients is we work on executive presence or we work on presentation skills. And I will record you we will watch that video of you talking together, and I will point out the things and you will point out the things that you see that you do not like. And it is really uncomfortable, but that's a perfect example of we have to do that work together, because if we don't face it, it's never going to improve. So I might ask you to record a one-on-one, and you might just be cringing as we listen to the phrasing of you trying to like be eloquent on the spot or practice a new thing. And then we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again. So that, you know, my goal is that if you're learning a new thing or you're trying to practice something, when it counts is not the first time that you're doing it. You're doing it with me. Baseball players can go to the baseball field. You can go to the pitch and play football with your friends. You can do practice for so many things in so many safe areas. And for leadership, we often just wing it. We kind of just say like, okay, well, I think I'm going to say this. And then like, boom, you're laying someone off, or you're giving them really difficult performance feedback, and you haven't done a dry run with someone before. And that's what coaching can be really great for. Don't let that high stakes thing be the first time that you're doing something.
I love that you called that out. I remember when I did my skiing instructor training, as part of that, what you do is you get recorded skiing. And then in the evening, everybody sits down, and there's like 20 people and 3 really qualified skiing instructors. They look at the video and they just critique the shit out of you, right? And it feels incredibly uncomfortable, and they just do it for the whole room. But you actually kind of get used to it. Like by the end of the skiing instructor training, that was just a normal part of what we did, right? Like just every evening we'd sit down and critique our form. And it's by far the most meaningful step change improvement in my skiing that's ever happened, because it's you, first of all, you see yourself, but then you also start seeing yourself in the way that the other person's seeing you, right? And so this really experienced skiing instructor will say, your butt is out by 2 centimeters, right? Like your butt is out too far, your form is off. And you'll look at that and you'll go, my butt is out. I didn't even notice that before, but that's totally right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And because you can't see yourself physically, and it's the same thing in a one-on-one, because you can't see yourself in the moment, how would you ever know how to improve, right? And so I think I love that you called that out, because that's been, in my experience, transformational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to answer that second part of your question is like, what do you look for in a coach? Because it is so personal, people have different criteria. So I work with many women in engineering who it was very important to them to be coached by another woman who has gone through kind of and understands the scenario. I personally worked with a man when I got coached, because when I am in executive situations, I am often one of few women in the room, and it was really important to me to kind of have that, like that gender dynamic that often plays into my professional situations. I wanted that to come into play in coaching, because that's the scenario that I needed to operate in. So some people choose coaches that are very similar to them. Some people choose coaches that are very different to them for a very specific reason. But you need to have that chemistry, and good coaches will do a chemistry session when you're thinking about working with them, just to see if you kind of vibe together, that you get along, that you can talk to this person, because it is going to get real awkward, like I'm going to tell you that your butt's sticking out 2 centimeters. And if you don't want to hear that from me, or we don't have that relationship where you feel that like, that's something I can hear from you, then coaching is just not going to work.
Yeah, I think that is really the most important thing. Do you vibe with the coach?
Yeah.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for coming on the Future Founder Promise podcast. If you're listening and you vibe with everything that Laura just said, and you're considering getting coaching, or you would love to learn more about the initial topic of developer productivity, and you want to check out Laura's course, go to lauratacho.com, if that's correct.
That is correct.
And go reach out to her, go check out the course, go talk to her about coaching. Is there anything else that you want to shout out here, Laura?
I will just say a big thank you, Max. I think the Future Founder Promise is very interesting. And now, granted, I started a company that is services-based, that's coaching and consulting, and not a product company, but I have such a different respect for founders now being the CEO of my own company. So I think that's a really great thing to have at your company as well.
I appreciate you calling that out very much, Laura. Thank you so much for taking that time to come on the podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope we get to see you again very soon.
Same. Take care.
All right, everybody. Have a good one. See you in the next episode.